Welcome to Wents and Friends, episode 3. I'm Nina Mistry, your host for this episode. In this episode, I really want to tackle breaking the taboo of menstruation and menopause, raising awareness, removing stigma, and looking at the practicalities of managing symptoms, as well as discussing the impact on working doctors and surgeons and potential practical advice. To do this, I first interviewed a journalist, writer, speaker, and organiser working for women's rights and feminist approaches to social change, Karen Pickering.
I'm Karen Pickering, and I am a feminist writer and organiser living in Melbourne, Australia. I'm the co-author of About Bloody Time, the menstrual revolution we have to have, with Jane Bennett. And we wrote about the menstrual taboo and how pervasive and powerful it is and how it really harms everyone, but especially women and girls. And we made what I think is a pretty good case for the need to dismantle it and shared our recommendations for how to get there as quickly as possible.
From this interview, there were some amazing findings from the research compiled for the book, and we'll go into more detail about this during today's podcast. Essentially, the information in the book is based on surveys around menstruation and menopause of nearly 3,000 women and girls, and was originally commissioned by the Victoria Women's Trust to know about people's experience of menstruation and menopause, and it was used to help inform work of the Trust and also used to lobby government. The book argues on a new way of approaching menstruation and menopause by explaining how the menstrual taboo operates and what we can do to dismantle it. I also invited 3 panellists on the podcast to discuss their experiences within the NHS and the corporate world and how we can make a change and break the taboo. Before we listen to the panel's experience, why is it that women's health is secondary and treated as a taboo? Why is it that women's issues are seen as private, shameful, or even made fun of and diminished? Why is it that a basic physiological need and all of the related symptoms are ignored? Who made it this private? Breaking the taboo.
So the menstrual taboo is a set of attitudes that has formed over centuries in all cultures throughout different periods and eras of history that holds that menstruation is something to be ashamed of, something physically or culturally disgusting or dangerous or harmful in some way to people who come into contact with it. So there are a lot of theories about how it has evolved this way. Some of the really deep and complex ones are around the transition from paganism to different religious observation and the rejection of pagan worship, really, of like female reproductive power, and that in the shift to more patriarchal institutions that had to be reversed. But it's worth noting that all of the major religions have a specific menstrual taboo inscribed into either their traditions or their sacred texts. So if you want to think about how we've arrived at a point where across different cultures and languages and countries, everyone has similar views about menstruation being dirty or wrong or shameful. It's a pervasive and powerful set of ideas. Women and girls and other people who menstruate really never do it in a vacuum. It never happens in a way that where they are free of these ideas. And so the way that the menstrual taboo plays out, say, on girls in our culture or in Australia or the UK or in the minority world, is girls taking on a feeling of embarrassment or humiliation or shame at this really natural function of their bodies. And girls learning from the very beginning, maybe even before they start menstruating, through observing their mum or teachers or older girls at school or older sisters, modeling that humiliation and embarrassment and shame. And so it's really deep psychological, cultural work to unpack it and start to dismantle it. It's not surprising that our survey showed very few respondents had positive associations with their menstruation, felt as though their menstruation and menopause had been a positive experience for them that had real value in terms of their health and in terms of their identity. And yeah, the first half of our book is really making the case by breaking down the physical and physiological process. It's making the case for not only demystifying and understanding menstruation and menopause, but also seeing it as really valuable and really positive and a really powerful part of your potential power in the world.
So the aim of this podcast is really to open up the discussion, to raise awareness, to discuss potential practical advice, as well as trying to remove the stigma. So I've got 3 distinguished guests joining me on the podcast today to discuss this important subject matter, and I'll hand over to them to introduce themselves.
So my name's Rosie Barua, and I'm a consultant in intensive care medicine and anaesthesia in Edinburgh. I've been a consultant for nearly 10 years now, and my professional interests include point-of-care ultrasound, and my research interest is gender equity in medicine. As an extension to that, I have an interest in menstruation provision in the workplace, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here to discuss this topic here tonight.
I'm Helen Cox. I'm a consultant head and neck ENT surgeon in Sunderland. I've been a surgical consultant for 15 years. I'm the wrong side of 50 and suffering from the menopause. And I'm clinical director of head and neck, including maxillofacial surgery and audiology, as well as ENT. I also sit on the SAC, and I'm an intercollegiate examiner.
So I'm Lauren Turin, and I set up and run Women of a Certain Stage. What we do is speak out in the press and media to raise awareness in menopause. We work with organisations to help them understand why being menopause supportive is business savvy. And we provide solutions for women going through menopause, because we know that one size does not fit all. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to listen and to contribute.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much for being here today. So menstruation and menopause are topics that have remained a taboo amongst society for centuries now. And over recent times, there has been a bit of a shift. So there's been increasing exposure and more of a recognition that really we need to destigmatise and open up the conversation regarding the topic. So negative menstrual taboos perpetuate the idea that normal biological processes which are experienced by those individuals, and this includes women, girls, trans men, non-binary and gender questioning individuals, are something to be ashamed of or hidden. We were just discussing before we started this about Karen Pickering and the things that she said regarding menstruation and menopause. And I think what really came out from what she was saying was about the negative attitudes that are often felt, the shame. And it's not only experienced by the younger generation, it's felt across all ages. And it seems to have been the same for quite a long time.
There's an element where people don't like to see that this terrible thing is actually really powerful and pervasive in our culture too. And that can actually be something that's really useful to leverage. And you can get people talking and thinking about how the menstrual taboo is experienced everywhere. Surveys included girls from 12 years old up to women in their 60s and 70s. It was just an incredibly broad-ranging archive by the end. And because you had 12 to 18-year-olds talking to you about their experience of menstruation as it was happening to them, and you also had women aged between, 40 and 70 reflecting on what their menarche was like and what it was like for them to conceive children or to start menstruating again after having babies. So you had this kind of strengths and weaknesses of qualitative data, is that it is hard to sort of pin onto boards like butterflies, but it's so rich and so incredibly evocative. The really disturbing thing that came through very strongly was that irrespective of when the women and girls surveyed had their first period, they had all experienced very similar feelings of shame and stigma and reproach around it. So that was shocking, to think that women who had gone through menarche in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s were having the same problems as girls now. Girls now were saying they were embarrassed to get their period at school, or they didn't want anyone to see their menstrual products in their bag or at uni or at work. And that was shocking.
So some really interesting points from Karen there. Another thing that she mentioned was about managing symptoms at work. I just wanted to touch on this actually. We work in high pressure jobs and I just wondered what everybody's experiences were really of managing periods. First of all, Rosie, can I start with you?
So as an intensive care physician and anaesthetist, I do have the benefit of being able to, if somebody can let me out, get away for a period of time when I'm caring for a patient, which is not the case for surgeons. I think it's a whole different ballgame when you're a surgeon, and leaving an operation, even for a brief period of time, is not the same thing. But what I do have in common with surgeons is working in clinical areas where there's often events that are of high acuity, often quite unpredictable clinical sort of demands on me, and a lot of shift work, particularly in ICU and anaesthesia, where you're present in the hospital out of hours, often all around the hospital as well. So not just in the area where I'm based, but going out to see referrals, going out to other places, transferring patients across the hospital. And what I have found across my working life is that hospitals, despite being places that have a workforce that is majority female and a big proportion of whom can be expected to menstruate, they are not set up to allow people who are menstruating to manage their periods in any kind of a way that does not involve laser-like personal focus, assuming that periods are both predictable in timing and predictable in volume of bleeding, and they are neither. So particularly as an anaesthetist out of hours, I've been in theatre with my consultant at home when I was a doctor in training. Period comes on unexpectedly. Even if your ODP can let you away for a minute to go to the toilet, you have no period products on you. So you're left to stuffing your pants with toilet paper, or being on for intensive care at a weekend and running out of menstrual products because you thought you had that extra tampon in your bag and you didn't. And the shop shuts at 5 o'clock and there are no vending machines and you're out and about seeing referrals. So either you just go and ask random members of staff, do you have a tampon I can have? But otherwise there's no access to menstrual products in the hospital out of hours. So you're left with this bodily function, which is predictable in the sense that many NHS employees have them, but unpredictable in the sense you don't know when you're going to necessarily be affected by your period, with no structural things put in place to allow you to manage them. And unlike a lot of other biological functions, as Karen Pickering was talking about, the stigma around bleeding through your clothes, the stigma around smelling of menstrual blood because your pants have become wet with blood at the beginning of your shift and you're still wearing them 12, 13 hours later, is incredibly distracting and feels incredibly undignified. And I think at this stage of the world's evolution, the fact that we as a group of medical professionals and NHS workers are still having to deal with periods in this kind of way is, I think, a great shame.
Thank you. Helen, do you want to say something?
This is interesting for me because I have basically hormone manipulated my periods. And it all started when I was 16 and I was admitted to hospital for 4 units of blood because I'd been menorrhagic, lost so much blood. That's when life started to go and focus started around that whole issue. It was my O-level year and it was really difficult, actually. I'd had such an abysmal experience at school where every half an hour I was bleeding through tampon plus pads, and my HB was 6.8 when I went into hospital. So I then just hormone manipulated myself really through medical school with the combined pill, and then thought, well, I've had enough of polluting the waterways. Actually, I need to do something about it. And do you know, at some point I want everything to get back to normal and maybe start a family. And so then coming off of that hormone manipulation, that caused the other problem, which was totally never having a period for ages, and then eventually got back into some sort of form of normality. And as a consultant was fortunate to not be blessed with heavy periods during the latter part of my training. Then I had a child early on as a consultant, and I've then experienced the problem at the other end where it becomes very unpredictable and you have no idea what's coming. And to be fair, that has been the first time that I have had to go and get changed because the seat's covered in blood after I've stood up in clinic and gone, oh, that's really not what we were wanting. And exactly as you say, Rosie, all of that lack of provision, going to find my lovely speech and language therapy female colleagues to say, help, please, I wasn't expecting this. Everything's a mess at the moment. And then taking the whole thing again into my own hands so that I didn't have that problem again by moving forward to different kind of hormone manipulation. So that's the other way of playing it. We shouldn't have to. It shouldn't be that we have to do that. I did it for personal reasons because of my experience as a young child or a young girl. But we do need to, exactly as Rosie said, look at all that provision within hospital. The provision's appalling.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. In fact, I was looking at the statistics. So women actually make up 77% of the 1.3 million people that work in the NHS workforce. So if you work that out, that's over 1 million people that will be affected by these issues, menstruation, menopause. And there'll be another group of people, as we said at the beginning, including trans men, non-binary, gender questioning individuals who will also have periods as well. So it's a significant number of people that will be affected by this. So I'll move on to Lauren. Can you tell me about your experience?
My background, I'm very sporty. I've always been very active and very engaged in different sports and 7 days a week. So when I discovered that I had a 17-day cycle, I was none too pleased. So heavy bleeding was never something that I really had much experience of, but a 17-day cycle is really not a lot of fun. So much like you've been saying, using birth control to manipulate that and to regulate everything was pretty much what I did the whole way through my working life. And I didn't really give it much thought. I'll be completely honest with you. I came off birth control when I was 37 to have my son. And that was when I had the whole other experience. When we talk about menopause, I'll come on to that. But I think the thing that struck me the most was sitting in an open plan office of 400 people and getting a message on my computer from a colleague at the other side of the office saying, can you please come over here quickly and bring your coat? And I went to the other side of the office, not having a clue, being so naive about heavy bleeds because it wasn't my personal experience. And she just said, can you just wrap your coat around me, stand behind me and walk me to the ladies? So we walked through 400 people to get the ladies for her to strip off. And then she was wearing white trousers. And it was a case of just having to go. I just got my gym kit and she changed into my gyms and carried on for the rest of her day. But it just shouldn't be happening. And like you're saying, it's something that we absolutely need to normalise. We need to get the workplaces set up for an environment where we can thrive and we don't have to even think twice about these things.
The other statistic that came through really strongly was that across all of the age groups, around half of all of the surveys of the respondents said that they either liked nothing about their period or disliked everything about their period. And that was really confronting because even factoring in a percentage of people who maybe experience menstrual dysfunction or pain, it still meant that there were just so many people who just had automatically adopted a negative association and attitude around their menstruation. And that might start in your childhood and carry through until even after menopause. And so that's a heavy burden for half the world's population to be carrying, to feel as though this natural function of your body is disgusting or wrong or shameful and automatically something that you would just erase if you could.
So some really interesting points from Karen there. Can I ask you what you thought of that, Rosie?
What I've found in the time that I've been talking about this is if one person starts talking about it, people start sharing their stories and then sharing their stories more. And then before somebody in senior management hears about it, and that's maybe something I can talk about a bit later on. But I think because it's, inverted commas, a woman's problem, it's a private problem, it's something you don't talk about, even though it is something that we experience in very public forums. But there is that power in sharing stories. And certainly, as I say, since I've started talking about this, the number of stories you hear that are all identical, pretty much, given a few sort of twists to the story. So this is such a common experience. And with the numbers that you've just mentioned, this is a universal experience really in healthcare. So I think it's not that people don't want to talk about it. It's things like this podcast that just normalize the fact that this is a normal experience, that with appropriate management and policy backup can be made more tolerable. I think that's the thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Do Helen or Lauren, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that the key thing that I'm picking up as I'm working more and more with menstruation and menopause at work is that as women, we have started taking roles, working longer and later into life stepping into more leadership and management positions. And what we've done is we've brought with us this sack of masks and hats, and we've chosen subconsciously to carry on wearing those masks and putting those hats on and fitting in. And it's really only been in the last 18 months that we've started using our voice. We've always had a voice, but we've only started going, oh, actually, we don't work in an environment that's fit for purpose, but how do we bridge this conversation? How do we broker the changes? How do we make the cultural change? And until we speak up and we start to ask for the changes, why would anyone make them? So I think that's why I'm so delighted to be invited to have this conversation, because having all your voices together is the start of the change.
Yeah, it is just about breaking down those barriers, isn't it? I'm just wondering, do you have any sort of practical advice for doctors who are working long shifts, or anaesthetists and surgeons that are in theatre that are doing long cases? Have you, through the work that you've been doing and the research that you've done, have you come across any sort of practical advice that you can give to people?
We've already discussed hormonal manipulation. And for instance, I have a Mirena, which is great because I don't have periods anymore, which is fantastic for all sorts of reasons. But if you're trying to have a family, or if it just doesn't suit you, or you find IUD insertion too uncomfortable, which, let's face it doesn't take much to find it too uncomfortable, because it is pretty nasty. There's a whole heap of reasons why you wouldn't want to have one, or other methods of hormonal contraception taken for the purpose of controlling your periods. It isn't a matter of fact, especially for those of you who are head and neck surgeons doing your 9-hour neck dissections and then some. What are you going to do to control your menstrual flow for that period of time? And we've been, in my hospital, working with this great social enterprise called Hey Girls, which is a company that's based in Scotland that is committed to the idea of promoting sustainable period products. And one of the things that did not exist when I was a teenager, and oh my goodness, how it could have transformed my life if it had, things like period pants, which can last for 12 hours. And if you're going to be stuck, because they're designed to last for 12 hours, same with menstrual cups, which again, provided they have sufficient capacity, can keep you going for a long period of time and don't carry the risk of toxic shock. And they're also sustainable, which is fantastic. So there are ways that you can hopefully control your menstrual flow in ways that are environmentally sustainable, that hopefully take some of that mental distraction away from, am I going to start bleeding through? So when I unscrub at the end of the procedure, everyone's going to see the big stain on the back of my scrub.
Helen, do you have any practical advice, or is there anything, you spoke about hormonal manipulation, but is there anything else that you perhaps did differently with long cases when you knew that you were going to be bleeding?
So I think you need a break in a long case. It's not good for yourself. It's not good for your mental health. It's not good for your tummy. It's not good for your waterworks. And it's certainly not good for your periods if you stood there all day. So I make sure that my trainees de-scrub regularly. I de-scrub regularly, and we move out and we shift around. And I make sure that they all get a comfort break, an eating break. Now, the flip side of that is if you're a female trainee in with a consultant male surgeon who has a macho attitude, I think that we're very fortunate in the specialty that we work in that doesn't exist as much as in some areas. But you could imagine that to go away from the table uninvited may be controversial now, but I think that we all need to go to the toilet. So that's a perfectly good reason to leave the table, and anyone who denies that is inhumane. We don't need an excuse about the fact that we've got our period to go. If you want to say that as well, make the surgeon more aware or perhaps more awkward, then good for you. But it's our right to use these facilities, and we just need to be a little bit more proactive. I think the issues come about with the bleeding is when you tend to forget that it's actually you've got your period. You forget about it because actually everything's just fine. And then all of a sudden there's that feeling where you think, oh, I'd forgotten all about that. I need the bathroom. And it's partly because our brain's engaged doing other things. But my advice is practical advice about taking time out and away and excusing yourself for a very justified reason. That would be my thoughts.
Yeah, some really good points there. Lauren, do you have anything to add?
I think you've covered the key points. I think the question that I would ask everyone listening is to say, who made this a private thing? Who made this something that is something we don't want to talk about? Who bought into that decision? And is that something you want to run with? Or are you going to be part of helping change the narrative around this? So I think there's a big mindset shift that's needed by everybody that's involved. And I think it starts with everyone listening. everyone that's questioning and challenging the status quo, because we really need to push this change forward.
Yeah, and that's where I think the idea of policies comes into play. So do any of you have or know about any menstrual policies that are put in place at work within your trusts or within your workplaces?
Because I'm in Scotland, this incredible place where everything is free, but for quite some time now, all schools and colleges and universities have menstrual products available free at the point of use. So they're in the toilets. And again, I've got a 15-year-old daughter, and she doesn't need to worry if she runs out of period products at school because they're just there in the toilets. And again, thinking, if I had that when I was at school, kind of awkward shoving stuff up your sleeve and trying to shuffle off to the toilets, it's such a simple thing. And I'm aware it costs money, but the difference it makes, and I can't even imagine for girls and other children who menstruate who don't have access to the financial means to buy their own products, that again, they don't have to worry about it because they're available in schools. And that's policy change driven by legislation that was driven through by a female MSP, Monica Lennon, who I think must have done that through rock walls with her bare hands. But that is one of the things that can happen, is we've been talking about changing the conversation and the priorities and the way that we view menstruation as just being something that happens to people, and the way that we walk into a public toilet and expect toilet roll to be there, we should expect period products to be there, because it's exactly the same category of product. It's an essential hygiene product that anybody might need at any time in their life. And so in our organisation, we don't yet have a formal policy, but we're in the process of putting together a pilot, which will happen on my hospital site, where we're going to have period products in all female and all unisex toilets, which will be sustainable period products, not reusable, but sustainable. And the aim of that is to get indicative costings and so forth, and then roll that out across the health board. There are only 5 health boards in Scotland who don't provide period products to all staff as well as patients, and mine is one of them. But again, there have been excellent examples up and down the country of staff putting together their own well-being based projects to provide period products. But I think if something is enshrined formally as legislation or as policy, policies and SOPs can be the bane of our working lives. But why they're there? Because somebody thinks that topic is important. And I think having it rubber stamped by your board, by your directorate, it gives it recognition as something that is important. And whilst these well-being efforts are, incredible, and kudos to the people who put them in place, ultimately this needs to be something that is seen by health boards and trusts as essential to the well-being and dignity of their staff, and therefore it should have policies and SOPs around it and should be financed as an essential hygiene product, because again, it's just normalization of a bodily function that affects so many people.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is absolutely right. And I'd love to see that here in England as well. Hopefully, whatever you find from your pilot will filter through to the NHS trusts here as well. I know that you've been quite vocal about it, because I was reading some of your tweets and some of the responses, seeing some of the responses on Twitter, in that people feel so strongly about the fact that this shouldn't be free.
And it's the framing of free. You're getting something for nothing, as opposed to this is correcting a historical omission of something which always should have been there. And I did an SSC project with some first-year medical students where they surveyed anaesthetists, all anaesthetists of all grades, all genders. And a lot of our doctors, we understand the physiology and the anatomy of menstruation, but a lot of males, especially senior anaesthetists, just said, where does this end? Are we going to provide razors and shaving foam for men? And it's the idea that they're in any way the same level of provision. And there seemed to be this almost ingrained resentment of, women are getting something for nothing. They're getting something free. Are they going to expect free lipstick next? And it just completely shows that there's a huge gulf between understanding the physiology and anatomy and chronology of menstruation and understanding the experience of menstruation, particularly working in the conditions that we do. And there seemed to be a huge gulf. And often it is these senior consultants who are the ones who are the policymakers, who are sitting on the committees, who are making the decisions, and they simply don't see it as an issue.
And that has to do with the fact that they don't obviously experience it, and that is the thing. But that's no excuse, I don't think, for understanding other people's points of view.
Another one of our recommendations was about the medical community and our hope or our wish that there could be at least that basic curriculum on menstruation included in a medicine degree, and that GP training in particular could include at least a working understanding of menstruation and menopause. We pulled some stats about, how often when women go to the GP, how often it's something that's either related directly to their cycle or that their cycle could impact on. And when you look at it that way, it seems unbelievable that GPs, because they've never specialised and they don't need to know, don't have a working understanding of menstruation and menopause as far as how it's such an important indicator of women's health.
So I think that Karen's right. It needs to be brought in as part of education for children, for doctors in training, and also for specialists who have finished their training. Can I just start by asking the panel?
What I find is that we're in a privileged position, actually, being consultants in a hospital. People listen to us, they respect us, and we have a voice and we are valuable. And the people, the majority of the workforce don't feel like that. And I think that therefore to have that opportunity to have a voice and to not use it actually is probably wrong, and we need to be using it for our nursing colleagues and our colleagues that we work with in theatres. And so I think that if we can start to open a dialogue at a higher level, then actually we can perhaps make some changes. And it's helpful to have a political decision that has enabled some of that change that we clearly are not seeing in England, and probably less likely to do so because the cost will be more significant. But I think that we should use our positions to try and be a voice for everybody to move this forward.
Thank you, Helen. So Lauren, I was just going to say, from a corporate point of view, I'm guessing that maybe things are different. Is there policies in place in the corporate world, in businesses and industry? And have you been involved in this? What's your experience?
It's fascinating, actually. And one of the key things I would say to any trusts listening is that when you look at the initial out to provide products, yes, that is a cost up front. But when you are supporting your colleagues, you're listening to your colleagues, they're feeling cared for, and they don't have to take the extra time off, or they're feeling more comfortable about just being who they are, the return on investment's huge. And it's not actually a difficult calculation to do. So I think that's one thing to bear in mind, because obviously working in the private sector, everything's a business case. Everything has to have a good return on investment.
I mentioned before that the menstrual policy at the Women's Trust has garnered a lot of media attention in Australia. And when it was first, but it was kind of hysterical, the level of outrage and shock at the idea that the Victorian Women's Trust has suggested that people just get days off to get their period. It's crazy. And then 3 and 4 years later, being able to say, we've had this policy in place at this workplace and many other workplaces, and the facts are clear that it reduces turnover, increases work productivity and workflow. It actually saw fewer days taken in leave because people were taking even fewer sick days because they were able to have accommodations and flexible work. And so therefore, the facts were able to then speak for themselves.
Over the last 8 years since I've been supporting organisations with menstruation to menopause policies, I've seen everything from using something like menstruation or menopause to be the initial policy to kick off and to open the conversation around women's health and about women's well-being. And then over the course of time, my longer standing clients have moved away from having a menopause policy to having women's health policy. So that's based around, if you are female and you have menstrual problems, if you have challenges with fertility, if you have miscarriage, if you have any related issues, come talk to us. Let's see how we can work together to manage this effectively. And then some of my clients have taken that a step further, and they've said, actually, we're no longer having a women's health policy. We're just having a complete policy for the health and well-being of our colleagues. And therefore, if there is something you need help and support with, then come and talk to us. So it's almost like there's different stages. We need to have something that we can, put a stake in the ground and say, actually, this is something we need to open the conversation on. Now, whether that's menstruation or menopause, I think we're going to use something, because we need to have a launch, have a policy, have some training, have some awareness, provide the right support, understand what the toolkit is to support people going through this and to support the people around us. Because the people working with us need to learn and understand and appreciate what's going on, because we can't expect people to support us if they don't understand and they don't have the knowledge. So I think different organizations are doing different things and everyone is somewhere on a journey. And I think it is going to be an evolution that will just take the next 5-10 years for people to start to not just do the policy and launch policies and do a bit of training, for it to actually seep through and for people to really start to believe what they're doing and for that to normalise.
This is the argument that Mary, the director of the trust, is always making to these sort of titans of industry at the big end of town, is that it can actually make workplaces more productive and can make you more money, because you are able to, for a start, you're retaining a workforce and you're keeping people happy and you're reducing turnover because you're saying, I see you as a whole person and I respect you. And I'm not so uncomfortable with your physical reality that it can't be mentioned in my presence, but also giving people the opportunity to work with their strengths and weaknesses at different times.
Yeah, that's really interesting because of the policies that were introduced in terms of being more supportive, being able to talk about it openly, working more flexibly, having the right type of freely available sanitary products perhaps in the workplace. All those kinds of things made a massive difference to people that actually didn't feel that they needed to stay at home and avoid work because of their period. Is there anything we haven't covered?
To maybe mention that I thought was really interesting in Karen Pickering's podcast is you're a surgical specialty, and surgery is traditionally so male dominated, not just in numbers, but in ethos. I know ENT is one of the more, in terms of numbers, gender equitable specialties. But I do wonder if exactly what Karen was talking about, that to be seen as a good surgeon, as a good doctor, you have to ignore anything that has to do with your womanhood and your female bodily functions, because to do so is admitting that you are not a typical surgeon. That's another thing that I think stops us from talking about this kind of thing in the workplace, because to mark ourselves out as different is to mark ourselves out as inferior. And again, I think it's really difficult to be the first person to speak out about this kind of thing and mark yourself out as different, which is why it's great to have senior clinical role models who is happy to say, actually, no, we're going to step out of this. There's no reason why we can't eat and drink for 10 hours. That's not how humans are designed to operate optimally. When I was training, I only ever had male ENT surgeons that I anaesthetized for, and that never happened. So I assumed it couldn't happen because something terrible would happen if you went out for 15 minutes. But surprise, actually, it's quite possible and probably improves the quality of your operating.
Sometimes the biggest opponents of menstrual policies or dismantling the menstrual taboo are women, and sometimes feminists as well. I think there are a lot of women and feminists who feel like the push to more openly discuss menstruation and menopause is one that undermines them, and that they feel as though they have worked very hard to achieve what I would say is the illusion of equality with their male colleagues. And so then they're very reluctant to discuss anything that might suggest incompetence or inability to work at exactly the same level as male colleagues. And I think that sometimes they're going to be the most difficult conversations to have because they are very nuanced and they are complicated. But I still ultimately think that pursuing a dialogue with people who are affected by menstruation and menopause in a workplace, it's understandable that women, certainly in some industries, feel as though giving any ground at all is setting them up to fail, and they're kind of right in the sense that that's how patriarchy operates, is that it forces women to mask their true needs, whether it's in terms of what's happening inside their body or what's happening in their homes or their family responsibilities or their need for the workplace to have less high octane language or less open conflict. Or, I think women have to, work on men's rules a lot. And I think that it's a really difficult reality for a lot of people. It comes down to, if you are going to always play by the rules that are given to you, you will always lose because they've been set up by the house. And the thing that usually got through to the women that I was talking to who were so reluctant was essentially me saying, how has this worked out for you? Do you feel as though you're respected and seen as a true equal in your field? Do you feel as though it helps you to mask your true feelings or what's going on in your body? Or are you really tired? Are you really exhausted from that? And the other really important thing that a menstrual policy does is that it does exactly what you asked at the beginning, which is it opens up the conversation and it signals to people in that workplace that it's okay to speak about this. And that straight away, I think, builds people's confidence and comfort to speak about it. But it also, I think, makes people feel seen and respected, and as though they're not going to be seen as weak or incapable or incompetent.
Lots of food for thought from Karen there. Can I just start by asking the panel what they think?
No, I do think that, as I've said before, I think it is important that senior leaders, that we have that opportunity to change things. I think it's really important to not try and be like the men, because we're not men and we need to be ourselves. I'm 53 next week. It's taken me a long time to feel comfortable in my own skin and to be myself at all times. And I think that comes with age and comfort, what you can do surgically, how you can approach life just in general. So we've got to use that voice that we have now.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we can move on to talking more about the menopause. But again, this is another subject that's really described as a taboo in the workplace. And I think research has sort of shown that many are suffering in silence because, again, they're worried about the reaction that they'll get from colleagues, from managers. How do they go about managing the symptoms at work? They're trying just to keep it to themselves and not discuss it. So again, we've already talked about the fact that within the healthcare industry, there's a predominance of females in the workforce, and many of these will be of that age within their sort of late 40s to 50s. So a significant number will be experiencing menopausal symptoms. And again, there will be other people aside from this group, which includes the trans, non-binary, intersex people that can also experience menopause. And then there's another separate group of the population, about 1 to 10%, who are a group that will go through early menopause or premature ovarian insufficiency. There's a number of people that will be experiencing these types of symptoms. Perhaps, Lauren, I'll start with you. If you can maybe talk a little bit about your own personal experience and kind of what you've been through and the journey that you've been on to get to where you are now.
Of course. So just to give you some context, my background is in neuropsychology, and I've always been fascinated by neuroscience, by mind-body connection. I'm a former personal trainer, sports therapist, nutritional advisor. I've got a real massive hunger for knowledge in human performance. I've dipped in and out of the corporate world. So I've done stints in the corporate world, then working with individuals and working in the sports arena, back in the corporate world. And now I'm working supporting organisations with menstruation and menopause. However, what came as a real shock to me, and the reason for mentioning the background, is that I left my job in my early 40s thinking I had early onset dementia. So when my doctor turned around and told me that it was just menopause, and actually when we unpicked it, we suspect that when I had my son, just before I was 38, that I probably went straight into menopause, because after I had him and finished feeding him, I went back on birth control to control my period again. And we suspect that my period just hadn't ever come back. So was it a premature menopause? Was it an early menopause? Either which way, I didn't know what I was going through because my periods were being masked. And it was one of those things that I sat there in the doctor's surgery. On one hand, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry because I was like so relieved. I was the happiest menopausal woman in Bristol. It wasn't early onset dementia. And quite frankly, I knew that menopause was just hot flushes and period stopping, right? How wrong was I? So it was quite fascinating to start diving deep, doing as much of the medical training to understand more about menopause, to learn about this natural life stage that we just don't talk about, that no one tells us. Can you imagine if all our young women had their first period and never heard the word period, or they never knew what it was all about? And yet that's what we do to middle-aged women. We allow them to get to their 30s when they become perimenopausal in their 30s and 40s if they're having a natural menopause. And we've never really discussed what it is or how it might impact them. So we know that over 86% of women don't know what menopause really is or what that's going to look like for them. I've spent the last 8 years really researching, working with, lobbying the government, working towards the changes with prescription charges, working towards changes with legislation for the Equality Act, with supporting us with employment rights, looking to work to have all our GPs trained in menopause as a mandatory training, which would be phenomenal as well. And I work with organizations, and it's just fascinating that actually, like we've been saying in this conversation, we pour ourselves into our jobs. We put so much of ourselves into getting to where we are in our career. And we do that thing that human beings want to do, which is we want to belong. We want to fit in. We don't want to do anything to stand out. And actually, shifting that status quo takes a lot of courage. But it's absolutely what we need to do. So for me, it started off with me kind of going to events and very quietly saying that I was Lauren Sheeran and I was a menopause coach or a midlife coach. And you could see people backing away from me at a rate of knots. And then when I got the courage up and I felt more confident, I had more business under my belt, I'd walk up and confidently shake someone's hand, introduce myself, say who I was, say what I did. And you could see people leaning in. These men leaning forward and going, my goodness, what a relief to meet you. Could you help me with my wife? Could you help me with my colleague, with my personal assistant? And the dynamic changed. And that was a big lesson for me, because what that taught me was when my stance was confident, when I could proudly stand there and say, this is what I do, this is what I'm here to help with and why it's important, everyone else comes with you. So I think the more confident we can get saying the words menopause or menstruation and talking about it and understanding why we're talking about it, I think that supports others around us to come on the journey with us. Yes, it's been a long journey and I love it. I absolutely adore what I do. And it's just brilliant that the NHS in bits and pieces is gradually coming on this journey too. So I'm delighted to keep on listening and hearing what else is going to come up today.
That's great, Lauren. Thank you. You've talked about NHS policy and about things changing. I think at the end of 2019, the BMA actually did a bit of a study. So they looked at challenging the culture on menopause in working doctors, and they had around 2,000 responses to their survey. And this brought up some really interesting results. I'm just going to tell you a couple of the results that they found was that so 93% of the respondents had experienced symptoms as a result of the menopause, and 65% of those had said that they were both physical and mental, but almost half had not sought any sort of support or didn't feel comfortable discussing it with their line managers. And in fact, one of the things that came from the report was the impact that it has on mental health, the thing that you described where you felt you had early onset dementia, which must have been such a scary thing. Actually, these are well-recognised symptoms, or perhaps not as well recognised as they should be, in fact, that they do occur for a lot of people. And it can really be magnified, I think, when you're working in a really high pressure and stressful environment, because it can leave people feeling quite overwhelmed. It means that they're exhausted and they often doubt their ability to actually be able to do their job properly. And that's another reason perhaps they feel that they can't speak up, or they'll seek other potential reasons for why they're getting those symptoms. For example, like several women do go and see their GPs because they think they've got anxiety and depression, and they're often prescribed antidepressants rather than it being recognised as being perimenopausal symptoms that perhaps something like HRT would be appropriate for. The results of it were really interesting, and actually they made quite a few action points as a result of the survey and recommendations to trusts. And I know that I think some trusts have obviously taken these things on board and have got menopause policies in place, but it's still not been taken on board by all of the trusts in the country. Do you have anything in your trust, Rosie, that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of. And again, I suspect that is an omission rather than a decision. And again, I think even additive to the menstrual taboo, there's this whole idea of women's worth being linked to their youthfulness, to their fertility. And I certainly feel, I've been a consultant 10 years, I feel like I'm moving into my professional prime. And I suspect a lot of female consultants feel that, having finished training at the age of 36 after maternity leave and working part-time. And the thought that I'm 45 now and I know I'll be moving into the perimenopause, the thought that I'm ready for the scrap heap seems absurd. But again, I think there's so much menopausal stigma around the idea that, oh, you're now just going to turn into who's just forgetful and comes to work with eyeshadow in one eye because you've just become distracted. And it's almost like this comedy trope, isn't it? But speaking about destigmatizing and myth busting, there has been so much more conversation, even in just the last 2 or 3 years, about menopause. I had no idea it could cause anxiety and depression. I just knew about the vasomotor symptoms and I knew about the menorrhagia around the time of menopause, but I didn't know that it could manifest like that. I didn't know that the symptoms could start so insidiously and for such a long time before your periods actually stopped. And again, I went to medical school, I did endocrinology. So again, it's that difference between knowledge and experience, and the power of sharing experiences that I think will mean that when I feel that I may have issues with the menopause, I will go to my GP and say, I think this is perimenopause and I would like to discuss hormone replacement therapy. But as I was speaking about menstruation, I do think that there are a whole bunch of things, especially as an intensivist working during the pandemic in PPE. I know some of my senior nursing colleagues who have really struggled with vasomotor symptoms, fully donned up in PPE and coping with heavy menstrual bleeding as well. And so whilst policymaking in pandemic times is always very challenging, it's absolutely a part of the course that we will be dealing with working in PPE for the foreseeable future. So that's exactly the kind of thing we need to weave into workplace menopause policies, especially for people working in specialties like intensive care medicine, where you will be wearing all this kit and you need to be able to get to the toilet and you need to not be able to be under kind of these plastic gowns and FFP3 masks and things like that. If we don't have one, we need to have one. And it should really be national, because I know the BMA and other unions as well have put forth guidelines for organisations to have menopausal champions in every department, and for line managers to have training in recognising the needs of the menopausal worker, who can then refer them on to champions if they themselves feel they're not the best person to discuss these. These have already been produced, and it's a question of us becoming more aware that the need is there and making sure that they're enacted into policy within the NHS.
Oh, Helen, are you happy to share kind of your experience to date?
Yeah, no, of course. I was 40 when I had my son, like leaving it till the last minute. And then things returned to normal for a bit after then. But I then started getting the problems with the heavy periods again and the issues that we talked about before. And then I also had a marina for that, along with a very unpleasant biopsy. And the moving from that and then getting all the kind of, so the period stops, that was great. I didn't have to worry about that anymore. But then I started to get really quite a significant hot sweats. They wake me up at night. So every night was disturbed, every night. You can feel it coming before it becomes a sweat. It's not even a sweat, it's a heat. But there's this kind of feeling that kind of comes over you, or I experience almost there is a slight of anxiety sort of feeling and palpitations in your chest as it comes, and it's coming, and then you can start to feel this sort of heat rising, and it's quite horrible when you're in the middle of an operation. I have to stand away from the table, and my anaesthetist is a guy, a lovely bloke, but he just goes, "Oh, Helen, you're having another moment," and we all stop and we all go, "Yes, I'm having a moment," and I fan myself, and my registrars just have to put up with my moments, if you like. And I tell them that they've got wives and they've got daughters and this will happen to them and they need to understand it. I was putting up with it, and I talked to a number of my girlfriends who are at a similar stage, and some of them had experienced this brain fog, and as you said, that they thought they were getting dementia because they were forgetting things, they couldn't cope at all. And my salvation was actually a friend who's a GP who was an ENT registrar, who is incredibly vocal in provision of products to help you through this, and really sent me lots and lots of stuff about biosimilars, where you can get estrogen gel to put on so you don't have patches, but that it supposedly comes from natural products, from yams, I believe. And she sent me all this information, and information for your husband to read around the menopause and what he was to expect. Loads and loads of stuff, which if I'd gone to my GP, I wouldn't have got. But it allowed me during the COVID era to say, when you couldn't get an appointment with your GP, to basically email them and say, "Hello, these are my symptoms, this is what I'd like, please." And then they phone me up, consultation, "Well, yes, that's fine, we'll give you some of this stuff." And within probably about a month, it was much better. I don't have that same problem.
That's really interesting to hear. Thank you for sharing that, Helen. It's really refreshing actually to hear you speak so openly about it. What can we do to encourage more trusts to take these topics on board and develop policies in these areas? Is there something we should be doing?
I think it's you doing it. You're doing it by opening the conversation and by continuing to have that conversation. I think it's really important. It's interesting to me that it doesn't always come from one particular source in an organisation. So people might think, oh, it's HR or it's diversity and inclusion. Actually, it's usually someone who's passionate about the topic that kicks off the change. And whilst HR might own the policies, it's often not them that will initiate this. So having someone that's passionate, that believes that we need to make change, that can drive this forward, who's got a voice, or who is connected to somebody who's got a voice, who can be that senior stakeholder, who can speak up, who can be the advocate. Getting even a small group of women together to have something like a menopause social event every 4 to 6 weeks doesn't have to cost a lot of time, or it doesn't have to cost money. But if we know that on the first Friday of every month at X o'clock, or whatever time every few weeks, a certain event is happening remotely or in person, and it's just an open event for anyone who's interested in finding out more about menopause, or to share what's working well and to share their experiences and to be there to support. I think that's really important, because that's what we're not doing. We're not talking, we're not sharing, we're not telling each other what is normal during menopause. So we end up feeling isolated, we end up feeling alone. We find ourselves trying to mask all of this stuff and not dealing with it. So I think setting up some way, whether it is something on the intranet, whether it's a physical location, whether it's an online place where people can dip in and out of, is a great place, because when you get a group of people together who are passionate about this, who are experiencing menopausal symptoms, that can then collaborate because they're people doing jobs in the real world, they can feed back up the line about what would make real change for them. It's about lobbying all those individuals and just saying there is a missing policy here, there is missing awareness. And the awareness training is not for women, not for people going through menopause. The awareness training is for everyone. This is not a women's issue. This is an issue of life, and this is a life skill for people to be able to recognize and understand what menstruation is, to recognize and understand what menopause is. Because when you've got someone that you're living, working, or socializing with, and they're going through this, how much richer is your relationship going to be with them if you can be empathetic, if you can be supportive? We're not asking you to go and fix anything. None of us want to be fixed. We just want to be listened to, and we want to be supported. So I think in terms of driving change forward, this is a great place to start.
Great, thank you. Rosie, Helen, do you have anything to add on that?
So I think exactly as you say, Lauren, we're starting the conversation and we've got that door open, and we've got to keep pushing at it now to get some change.
Yeah, that's great. The only thing that I was going to say was actually one of the comments that was made in the BMA report by one of the senior women, who said that as a senior woman in a profession which is male dominated, she felt that if she did open up about her menopausal symptoms, that she would be stigmatized or disrespected as somebody who was no longer rational or capable of doing a job. And I think that fear is real, unfortunately, and that's why people don't like to speak up about it. But actually what we have said today is that this dialogue really needs to change, and that we do need to speak about it. Lauren, you were going to add something.
I think one of the key things that I find quite interesting is when you think about us as women, we go through, or anyone going through menopause symptoms, we've gone for about 37 years having a menstrual cycle, at which point we're roughly halfway through our adult life. Halfway. Only halfway. So when we hit menopause, we've got this whole other half of our life to live. And in societies and cultures where women are revered and they're the matriarchs of society, we see menopause as a badge of honour, because we recognise the skills, knowledge and experience that women have to offer. And I think that's a big part of the switch that we need to start to make. We need to make that switch. We need to start to recognise that and own that and talk about that, as opposed to the stereotypes that people have traditionally had around menopause. So I know I fell foul of not wanting to speak out because I didn't want to be seen as weak or vulnerable, being the only female in an 18-strong team. And I wish I knew then what I know now, because I would have spoken up. So I think it's making that switch. It's recognising that we've got so much to offer in so many parts of society, and we're only halfway through. So if we've done all of what we've done when we got to this point, can you imagine what we can do in the next half? So I think that's what's really exciting, because I don't think we're going to recognise the workplace, society in the next 10 to 15 years. I think it's going to be entirely different.
There's so many reasons to have young people and young women especially learn all of this stuff from the very, very beginning. But it really carries through, and it benefits everyone. It benefits their partners, it benefits their bosses, it benefits their children, you know. And so I think that there's there are such good arguments for the people who just are interested in how does this help me?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, all of you, for your thoughts and on the subject. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here to discuss these. I think is a very important and valuable topic. And I so value your honesty and openness, because I think that has really been what's really made this conversation so enlightening, at least for me today. So I think the one thing is clear, that we really need a much more mature and progressive attitude to both menstruation and menopause. And we need to really understand the impact that it's having on individuals at work who are really navigating their professional lives. So a key thing that's come out of this is developing a menstrual and menopause policy. So hopefully this conversation's a step in the right direction, highlighting the problem, promoting a new positive culture surrounding the topic, and hopefully reducing stigma that's attached to it. Thanks so much to all of you for being here today and for taking part in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Wents and Friends. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and please do get in touch at the email wents@entuk.org, or you can follow us on social media to join our conversation. We would love if you could leave a review with your podcast provider, and do share this episode with your networks, and let's break the stigma and change our working environments for the better.